Hello there, and welcome to a quiet corner of the world where history gently hums you to sleep. I'm so glad you're here. Before we begin, tell me just in your heart, where are you listening tonight? Is it early in the evening or deep into the hush of midnight? Wherever you are, whatever the hour, I'm here to keep you company, with stories wrapped in time and dusted with a little wonder. And if you find yourself returning to this sleepy space again and again, you might like to follow along so you never miss another tale whispered from the past. Now, close the doors of today behind you. Let's drift together, back through centuries, to candlelit halls and moonlit barns, to snowbound cottages and starlit fields. Tonight, we step into a world where the night was long and strange and sacred. A world where people slept not once, but twice. Where beds were shared, not out of love, but out of necessity. Where some curled up in hate, and others dozed beside warm embers on stone floors. These are the weird sleep habits of medieval people. And more, not tales of kings and battles, but of yawns and snores, of nighttime routines lost to time, soft, strange customs that once made perfect sense. In the glow of a medieval moon, so settle in, and let's begin our quiet journey into the sleepy secrets of the past. Imagine a world with no electric lights, no glowing screens, no street lamps outside your window, no bedside clock glowing faintly in the dark. In the medieval world, darkness fell fast and hard. Once the sun set, the fire or a few candles were the only light between you and the blackness, and when that light died, so did the day. But people in medieval Europe didn't simply fall asleep and wake 8 hours later. Their sleep was split into two distinct parts, a first sleep and a second. The concept might seem strange to you, but for centuries, this was completely normal. In the countryside, where most people lived, the day was tied directly to the sun. People labored long hours plowing, planting, cooking, spinning until the light faded. Supper was eaten early, often before sunset in winter. With little else to do after dark, families would retreat to bed soon after the fire was banked. That marked the beginning of what was called the first sleep. This first sleep generally lasted from around 8 or 9 p.m. until midnight or so. Sleep was communal for most people. Entire families, even guests, often shared beds. Privacy was nearly non-existent. Children slept next to parents, and servants often lay down near the hearth or in corners of the same room. The bed might be nothing more than a straw-stuffed sack on a wooden frame, or even just a pile of rushes and woolen blankets on the floor. But in that quiet dark, they slipped into a deep, early slumber. Interestingly, people at the time didn't find it odd to wake up in the middle of the night. In fact, they expected it. At around midnight, or a bit later, people would awaken. This wasn't due to a noise, or insomnia, or a restless night. It was part of a natural rhythm. The body would stir after the first sleep, and what followed was a strange kind of in-between time known as the watch. This wasn't seen as a problem, it was simply how nights worked. In this period of nighttime wakefulness, which could last an hour or more, people would tend the fire, say prayers, check on livestock, or even do light chores. Some used the time to think or meditate. Others read, if they were literate and had light. And many took the opportunity to talk quietly, reflect, or be intimate with their partner. Medical texts from the time even recommended this period as the best time for conception, citing the body's natural warmth and calm. This split sleep pattern shows up in literature and diaries. Throughout the pre-industrial world, from Chaucer to French medical journals to Italian household guides, it was so ordinary that people rarely explained it. It just was. What makes this pattern even more intriguing is that it may not have been unique to medieval Europeans. Anthropologists have found similar sleep patterns in traditional communities around the world with no access to artificial light, which raises an interesting question. Was segmented sleep the natural human sleep pattern before modern life changed everything? And if so, what exactly happened to the second sleep? When the first sleep ended, and people stirred under their coarse woolen blankets or straw-filled mattresses, the world outside remained dark and quiet. But inside homes, this brief return to wakefulness, known in some records as the watch, was an accepted, even valued, part of the night. There was no rush to return to sleep, no frustration about restlessness. Instead, this hour or so of midnight wakefulness was built into the rhythm of daily life. In village homes, this period might begin with a soft stirring, someone rising to stoke the fire, perhaps adding a fresh log, or turning the embers with a poker to keep warmth alive until morning. The chill of the night made the hearth a magnetic center. In wealthier households, servants might wait quietly to tend to lamps, or prepare for the Lord's early hunting party. In monasteries, bells would ring to summon monks to matins, a midnight prayer session conducted by candlelight, one of the many scheduled prayers that broke up their sleep into regimented blocks for ordinary people. Though this time between sleeps was more personal. Some sat up quietly, whispering thoughts to their bedfellows. Others prayed, either privately or together as a family. In rural homes, this period was often used for intimate conversations or reflection. In some cases, this was when people shared quiet stories, confessions, or recounted dreams from the first sleep. A few may have even used the time to tend to small tasks like mending clothing, preparing dough, or spinning wool chores that required calm, not daylight. Interestingly, medical guides from the late Middle Ages often referred to this watch as a time when the body and mind were especially well balanced. Physicians advised patients to use the watch for medication, reflection, or, notably, marital intimacy. The belief was that after a few hours of rest, the body was relaxed and at its physical best, neither tired nor overly stimulated. This practice was not isolated to Europe. Anthropologists studying communities in Nigeria, Madagascar, and even some First Nations groups in North America found similar rhythms. An early evening sleep, followed by a period of wakefulness, and then a return to slumber. Without the harsh intrusion of electric light, humans around the world may have settled into a natural two-part sleep as part of our evolutionary design. So what changed? By the 18th and 19th centuries, references to first sleep and second sleep began to fade from writing. Diaries and letters, once casually filled with mentions of midnight wakefulness, became quiet on the subject. Scholars now believe that the slow march of industrialization, the expansion of artificial lighting, and the new pressures of the factory clock fundamentally altered our biological routines. People stayed up later, pushing their bedtime toward midnight instead of beginning their night shortly after sunset, and with rising demands for productivity and fixed working hours, the long, leisurely gap between sleeps was compressed or erased entirely. But what was lost in the process? Was it just a forgotten curiosity of medieval life for something deeper, about how humans relate to rest, quiet, and time? And more importantly, what did the second sleep feel like once the watch was over? After the quiet stillness of the watch, the hour or so of waking rest, whispered prayer, stoked fires, or quiet conversation, people in medieval Europe would gradually return to their beds. This was not a rushed or anxious moment, nor was it guided by alarms or obligations. Instead, sleep returned naturally, gently, like a second tide. This second rest, often beginning in the early hours between 1 and 2 in the morning, was known simply as the second sleep. It lasted until dawn. This second sleep was often lighter than the first. Many medieval texts describe it as a time rich with dreams, visions that were sometimes interpreted by priests or woven into folklore. The famous physician Galen believed that the second sleep, being closer to daybreak, was the most fertile ground for prophetic dreams and spiritual clarity. Others, especially in more superstitious households, avoided certain foods before sleep to keep nightmares from intruding into this delicate final phase of the night. In rural villages, where roosters marked the coming day and windows were just wooden shutters against the cold, waking from second sleep was usually gradual. There were no precise wake-up calls, no devices measuring REM cycles, just the slow change of light. People might stretch, shift under heavy blankets, listen for the rustling of animals or the stirrings of family, and only then rise its worth, noting that this rhythm to sleeps with a waking interval allowed for a more flexible and natural approach to night and rest. It was not framed as a disorder or an inconvenience. No one lay awake at 1 a.m. wondering if something was wrong. With them, they accepted waking in the night as part of the design. In contrast, modern sleep culture, with its insistence on an unbroken 8-hour block, leaves many people distressed when they wake at night, not realizing they're reenacting something quite ancient. By the 19th century, the idea of 2 sleeps began to vanish almost entirely from the Western world. Gas lamps, and later electric lighting, transformed city nights into extended versions of day. The spread of coffee houses and late-night public venues shifted social life later into the evening, and the factory system demanded early mornings, precise schedules, and shorter nights. With those changes, people began sleeping later, collapsing into bed exhausted and pushing their bedtime closer to midnight. There was no longer space or silence for the midnight watch. The notion of getting up at 1 a.m. to pray, talk, or sit in contemplation felt outdated. Second sleep became obsolete because it stopped being natural, but because society stopped making room for it today. Some researchers and sleep scientists are beginning to revisit this old pattern. Modern sleep studies have confirmed that, in the absence of artificial light, human beings often revert to segmented sleep within just a few weeks. The body appears to remember. In fact, people in sleep experiments often describe the waking interval between first and second sleep as the most peaceful part of their day, an experience of rest without urgency, silence without anxiety. So what does it mean that we left this behind as we fill our nights with light, noise, screens, and schedules? The calm midnight watch, once a universal experience, has become almost myth. But buried deep in the rhythm of our bodies and the hush of long-forgotten nights, something still remembers. And perhaps the next time you wake in the middle of the night, staring into the dark with no clear reason, you'll know. You're not alone. You're simply waking between the 2 sleeps, in the cold stillness of a 14th century European town. The only sounds you might hear after midnight were the wind, rustling through wooden shutters, or the muffled clatter of hooves on cobblestone as a lone rider passed by. But somewhere in the distance, a steady footstep echoed down the narrow lanes, the town watchman on his nightly patrol. He carried a staff, perhaps a lantern, and wore a cloak thick enough to cut the damp. His job was simple, yet critical: walk the streets, keep an eye out for fires, thieves, or trouble, and make sure the night passed without incident. But there was a hidden truth known to every apprentice and veteran in this line of work. By the last third of the night, most watchmen were asleep. In the medieval imagination, the watchman was a figure of both duty and irony. Town charters across Europe, whether in England, France, or the Low Countries, outlined the need for a night watch. Cities were growing, crime was rising, and fire was always a threat. A simple cooking hearth, if left unattended, could set an entire street ablaze. But enforcement was inconsistent. Most towns could not afford to pay professional guards, so the job rotated among citizens, apprentices, or soldiers owed service to the town. These temporary watchmen, often unpaid or poorly compensated, expected to stay awake all night, patrolling on foot in bitter weather. In some towns, especially after curfew laws were introduced, watchmen were tasked with stopping passers-by and asking for their names and business. Anyone found on the streets after a certain hour without good cause could be fined, arrested, or simply told to go home. It was a position of modest authority, but not glamour in reality. Though the night was long, cold, and deeply uneventful. After the fire checks and the first few rounds, the temptation to rest grew stronger. The flickering glow from a bakery's oven, still warm from the day's loaves, might offer a quiet corner to nap. In other cases, a watchman would quietly slip into a side alley and lean against the wall, pulling his hood low over his eyes. The risk of being caught. Low, after all. The only people awake to report him were probably asleep themselves, or fellow watchmen doing the same thing. This tendency became so widespread that legal records across Europe began to reflect the problem. In London, fines were imposed on sleeping watchmen as early as the 13th century. In Paris, town criers sometimes made surprise rounds to catch guards dozing. Even in smaller towns, ordinances were occasionally passed forbidding watchmen from sitting down or resting under any shelter. But enforcement was patchy, and the fatigue was real. In a world without street lamps, without radios, without even clocks to check the time, staying alert through the long winter night was more than a challenge. It was a quiet endurance test. And the line between diligence and exhaustion was thin. But did all watchmen really sleep through the danger? Or were some of them quietly watching more than we realize? The hour just before dawn was the most difficult. The fire checks had been made. The last stragglers had long since disappeared into homes, inns, or alleyways. And the cold, especially in winter, pressed down like a second layer of clothing, tightening around every joint. For the medieval watchman, this was the time when sleep crept in, not as a choice, but as an inevitable force. Some leaned against door frames, others crouched beside church walls or beneath thatched eaves. In coastal towns, the dock watch might huddle inside barrels or sit beside coiled ropes for warmth. In larger cities, watchmen sometimes grouped together in watchhouses, small shelters where firewood, benches, and a bit of ale made the long night bearable. These were meant for warmth and coordination, but more often they became makeshift dormitories. Surviving records from the city of York note that some watchmen were found slumbering with their heads upon their staffs, a poetic way to describe men asleep on their feet. In Paris, complaints were lodged about guards who made their entire shift within taverns. only venturing out at dawn to make it look as though they'd patrolled all night. But sleeping on duty wasn't just laziness. It was often the only practical response to a poorly designed system. Most watchmen weren't professional guards or soldiers. They were local men, craftsmen, apprentices, retired laborers pressed into service for a night or a week at a time. They had full workdays ahead. Many were not compensated, and the city's demands rarely came with support. In some towns, being caught sleeping might result in a small fine, but staying awake might cost you a day's labor or your health, especially in the freezing damp of late winter. Despite this, not all watchmen were careless. In fact, many took their jobs seriously. Fires were no joke. A single chimney flare-up or dropped candle could consume rows of timber-framed homes. In London's Cheapside district, the night watch was expected to check on bakers whose ovens remained hot long after sunset. Their vigilance sometimes prevented disaster. More quietly, watchmen also played a role in keeping the social fabric. Together, they reported strangers, escorted drunks, and occasionally intervened in disputes that spilled out from homes or taverns. Though often feared or mocked by locals, they were also a source of comfort. A distant lantern glow in the street, or the sound of boots crunching over gravel, meant someone was out there watching. Some communities even developed informal traditions to support the watch. In the town of Lüneburg, it's said that residents left out mugs of beer or bread for the guards passing by. Not always officially sanctioned, but quietly understood. Still, the balance between vigilance and fatigue remained delicate, and as towns grew, the need for better organized, better paid watchers became clear. Some cities responded with professional night patrolsmen who were trained, paid, and supervised. But these reforms came slowly. For many decades, the sleepy figure of the watchman remained a familiar part of medieval life. Drowsy, underprepared, but undeniably present. So what changed? What finally pushed cities to wake their guards and reshape the system? And in a world still lit by candlelight, what did being alert truly mean? As the 15th century approached, Europe was transforming. Cities grew denser, commerce expanded, and with more people came more risks, more thefts, more fires, more noise after curfew. The sleepy system of unpaid citizen watchmen, once tolerated for its informality, could no longer keep pace with the changing rhythms of urban life. Some towns took the first step by introducing stricter rules. Watchmen were told to walk specific routes, report at checkpoints, and carry horns or bells to raise alarms. In places like Bruges and London, rotating watch schedules were posted publicly, and absences or infractions were punished by community fines. Still, enforcement was inconsistent, and sleeping guards remained common. The real shift came when cities began to realize that simply having a watch wasn't enough. They needed to trust it. By the mid-15th century, places like Florence, Nuremberg, and parts of London began to experiment with professional night watchers, paid guards, hired full-time by city councils. These men were often former soldiers, aging laborers, or others deemed reliable enough for the task. They were trained to patrol more strategically, keep records, and even carry weapons. They were required to stay awake, check in with superiors, and were often paired with bell ringers in towers who marked the passing hours. The results were uneven but noticeable. Fire outbreaks dropped in districts with professional patrols. Streets were quieter, and curfew violations decreased. The watchmen, no longer just sleepy volunteers with cloaks and clubs, became recognizable symbols of order, uniformed, trained, and increasingly accountable. Still, remnants of the old ways lingered. In smaller towns and rural areas, voluntary watch service continued for centuries, even into the 17th and 18th centuries. The cliché of the sleeping guard appeared in satirical prints and local ballads, often portrayed as bumbling, heavy-lidded, or drunk. But the culture was shifting. Urban life no longer tolerated the casual nap on duty. Some towns innovated even further. In Prague, large dogs were trained to patrol with night watchmen, offering companionship and assistance. In Amsterdam, night watchtowers were erected at key intersections, equipped with bells, lamps, and logbooks. These hubs allowed guards to warm themselves while remaining visibly an answer, in part, to the temptation of sleeping in shadows. And yet, even in the midst of reform, a simple truth remained. Humans were not made to stay awake all night. Fatigue, cold, and boredom made the job endlessly difficult. No matter how many rules were introduced, the night still had its quiet power over the mind and body. The best watchmen weren't just those who stayed awake, they were the ones who learned to listen to the city's silence, to interpret the meaning of a distant crack or flicker of light. Eventually, with the rise of modern police forces in the 18th and 19th centuries, the medieval watch system faded into history. Professional, centralized policing replaced the informal and often sleepy guards of the past. But the memory lingers in language and culture. Phrases like "on watch" or "the graveyard shift" echo the long hours spent under moonlight, with only a lantern and a city's quiet breath for company. And maybe now, when we imagine the night patrols of the past, we might think not just of slumbering guards, but of resilience, adaptation, and the slow transformation of how we keep each other safe in the dark. Imagine yourself in a remote Scandinavian village, somewhere deep in the mountains of Norway, or among the dark pine forests of northern Sweden. It's December. The sun barely crests the horizon, offering just a few pale hours of daylight before darkness settles back in like a heavy blanket. The air is dry and sharp. The earth is frozen. Snow coats the moss-covered stones and clings to the thatched rooftops of wooden homes. The entire landscape seems to exhale and then pause. This was the season of stillness, and with it came something peculiar, something not quite sleep and not quite wakefulness. It was a practice, or more accurately, a pattern of survival, in which people across northern Europe slowed their lives to the bare minimum through the long winter. Today, historians and folklorists refer to this cultural rhythm as seasonal semi-hibernation. While humans do not biologically hibernate like bears, the behavior of many Nordic villagers came surprisingly close. With daylight scarce and food supplies tight, people in certain parts of Scandinavia entered a state of prolonged rest during the coldest, darkest months. They weren't unconscious, but they weren't fully alert either. Instead, families spent long stretches of time in bed, wrapped in furs or woolen blankets, doing as little as possible to conserve body heat and energy. There's an old Swedish term, vinterdvala, meaning winter slumber. Though rarely used today, it captures the essence of what life once looked like in remote, snowbound settlements. The agricultural year was over, trade routes were closed, and animals were sheltered in barns. The day might begin with a bit of porridge, then long hours of silence or quiet murmuring, and finally, a return to sleep well before the sun had fully disappeared. Firewood was precious, and homes were often heated only at the center, leaving outer rooms cold enough to freeze water overnight. Staying in bed wasn't laziness. Sit was survival. By limiting movement and staying warm beneath shared bedding, families could reduce their need for calories and heat. Many even adjusted their sleep patterns to match the darkness, waking briefly in the middle of the night, speaking softly, praying, or telling stories, and then drifting off again. Interestingly, this practice wasn't limited to isolated cabins. In Icelandic sagas and early Norwegian records, there are hints of social customs that revolved around this quiet season. Winter guests were welcomed not with entertainment but with shared silence and sleep. Work was deferred. Even the churches held shorter, quieter services out during the darkest weeks. The body, too, responded. People reported feeling sluggish, often sleeping 12 to 16 hours a day. Metabolism slowed. Hunger waned. Some speculate that low light and poor nutrition may have induced a kind of natural, torpor and instinctive slowing that echoed what was happening outside. Stillness, cold, and waiting. But was this winter dormancy purely out of necessity? Or did it reflect a deeper relationship with time, one that modern life has forgotten? To understand how people survived the Nordic winter with so little activity, you have to picture life inside one of those wooden cottages, narrow, smoky, dimly lit, and often packed with people. In regions like Lapland, rural Norway, and the Swedish interior, families lived in small one-room homes known as stugas or torps. The fire crackled at the center, but the warmth rarely reached the corners. At night, temperatures inside could dip well below freezing, and yet entire families, parents, children, grandparents, endured this long, dark season together, mostly horizontal, mostly quiet. They slept in clusters on raised wooden platforms, often layered in wool blankets, furs, and straw bedding. If the family had livestock, such as goats or sheep, those animals were often kept in the same room, partly for warmth, partly for safety. Their breath steamed in the cold air, mingling with the smoky haze from the hearth. The air was thick with the scent of wool, pine, and earth. Days passed slowly, marked more by the rhythm of waking dreams than of clocks or sunrises. People weren't fully asleep all the time. Instead, they drifted in and out of light sleep, conversation, prayer, and silence. Historians call this segmented sleep a common phenomenon before artificial lighting. In winter, it could stretch across 16 or even 20 hours, broken only by brief intervals of wakefulness in the middle of the night. When people whispered stories, checked the fire, or simply lay in the dark, staring upward, what did they think about, lying there for hours, barely moving? We can only imagine. Some probably worried about food supplies or next spring's planting. Others may have recited prayers or repeated local legends passed down for generations. In Iceland, traditional rim-along rhymed poems were often memorized and whispered during these long winter nights. Oral memory became both entertainment and survival. Interestingly, while the body was resting, the mind remained active. In these communities, dreams were often taken seriously, especially in winter. Some cultures believed the long night offered a sacred space for dreams to bring insight or warnings. Others saw dreaming as a form of mental travel, wandering where the feet could not in the snowbound world outside. Children learned early how to lie still, how to be quiet, and how to conserve energy. There was no real bedtime in winter, because night itself lasted nearly all day. Time lost its normal markers. A meal might happen at what we'd call 2 p.m. or 2 m, depending on when people stirred. The rhythms of winter were not dictated by hours, but by necessity. This wasn't a time of productivity, but neither was it useless. It was a time of endurance. To rest was to survive. To remain still was to preserve strength. Life was reduced to its simplest form: warmth, food, and quiet. And in that simplicity, perhaps, was a kind of peace, a way of living with the season, instead of against it. Yet one wonders, what happened when the light began to return? When the snow began to melt and the first signs of spring crept over the horizon? Did these communities emerge slowly, blinking into the sun, or were they already dreaming of motion, of change? When the snow finally began to recede and the pale light of spring grew bolder, the stillness that had gripped these northern communities began to loosen. The silence of deep winter gave way to faint sounds: the drip of melting ice from the eaves, the creak of wood adjusting to the thaw, the low bleating of livestock sensing the changing air. For the people who had spent months in a state of slow living, semi-sleeping, conserving, waiting, the return of light marked more than just a change in temperature. It was a signal to rise, literally and figuratively. Villages would stir in uneven waves. Some households resumed activity the moment the sun returned to the sky for more than a few hours. Others waited until the roads were passable or the fields showed signs of softening. Movement returned gradually. Early spring was not a season of celebration, it was a time of cautious awakening. Energy reserves were low. Food was often at its scarcest: dried meats, root vegetables, and the last of the grain had to last until the first signs of new growth. It was a hungry time. And yet, with the hunger came motion. Chores resumed. Tools were repaired, and animals were led out of their winter enclosures. People began to move, not because they were ready, but because they had to. Many communities marked the change with quiet rituals. In parts of Finland and Sweden, early spring was when stories and songs memorized during the long sleep were first spoken aloud in full voice. Elders would sit outside their homes and retell sagas, both real and imagined. Two children who had grown a season older while mostly asleep. Some households cleaned their bedding ceremoniously, shaking out the straw and moss, and burning old thatch to rid the house of winter spirits, or stalleness. In regions where Christian traditions had taken root, the return of spring often overlapped with Lent or Easter. These religious festivals, focused on rebirth and resurrection, took on special meaning in places where people had just endured months of near hibernation. The symbolism wasn't lost on them. Life was returning. But even with movement, the memory of winter lingered. People didn't rush into spring, they edged into it. The body, accustomed to stillness and long rest, took time to adjust. Just as animals blink at the sun after leaving their burrows, humans, too, moved carefully back into the light. Muscle aches were common. Fatigue persisted. The first long walks to neighboring farms or village markets were often slow and deliberate. There was no clear line between hibernation and wakefulness. It was a seasonal tide, ebbing and flowing. The lessons of winter patience, quiet, conservation stayed with people. They influenced how communities prepared for the next year, how they rationed food, and how they viewed time itself. Today, of course, electric lights, central heating, and the rhythms of modern work have all but erased the practice of seasonal sleep. The idea of lying still for weeks on end seems impossible, even absurd. And yet, in many of these same northern regions, winter, depression, fatigue, and restlessness remain common. It raises a quiet question. Were our ancestors wrong to slow down? Or were they more in tune with the earth than we are now? Mossy sleep strange, silent and half forgotten, remains a reminder that history is not only made by wars and kings. Sometimes it is shaped by the cold, by the dark, and by the simple, ancient act of waiting through the winter. In a peaceful village in Italy, a cool night breeze slips through a small window, and someone pulls their blanket a little closer. In England, a cup of tea still steams softly on a wooden table, while gentle rain taps on the window like a lullaby. And in Brazil, a slow ceiling fan hums through the warm night, as the soft sounds of crickets sing beneath the stars. Thank you for sharing this quiet journey with me tonight. If you'd like, leave a little note in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you now. And now, let's return to the story still waiting in the hush of the dark, soft as sleep, and just beginning to unfold. You find yourself in a medieval European town, perhaps a damp alley in London, or a narrow street in 14th century Paris. It's late at night, the cobblestones still warm from the day's sun. A thin fog rolls in. Most people are indoors, behind bolted wooden doors, curled beneath heavy blankets or animal skins. But a few figures linger huddled under makeshift coverings of sackcloth or dried reeds, pressed into corners or stretched out beneath stairwells. These are the ones who have no bed, no roof, and no home. Their ceiling is the sky in the medieval world. The concept of being homeless was far more common than modern life often recognizes. Town walls provided no guarantee of shelter. Travelers, laborers, beggars, and the chronically poor often found themselves sleeping in the open. It wasn't always desperation. It was sometimes necessity, sometimes custom. For many, particularly seasonal workers or itinerant craftspeople, life involved constant movement. Inns cost money. Alehouses closed their doors. Churches locked up after dark. So the night was passed wherever a body could rest. The phrase sleeping rough had not yet entered language, but the reality existed. There are court records from London and Norwich documenting fines for those found asleep on church steps, in market stalls, or beneath bridges. In Florence, sleeping in public could bring punishment, yet still it was done. Because when the choice is between punishment and freezing in the countryside, a covered doorway starts to look like sanctuary. Those without shelter developed quiet strategies for survival. In winter, they gathered near bakehouses or animal stables, where warmth leaked through thin walls. In summer, they followed the patterns of the moon, choosing spots based on light, insects, and airflow. Some lay on straw, others on bundled cloaks or worn-out sacks. Entire families sometimes slept this way, shifting together through the night to stay warm in cities. The best locations were often already claimed near sewer grates that released warm air, under overhanging roofs that offered a little dryness, or along riverbanks where trees softened the wind. But these spots came with dangers. Gangs roamed the streets. Night watchmen beat or robbed the vulnerable. Rats and fleas were constant companions. Rain could soak a blanket in minutes. Yet people persisted. For many, the line between a home and homelessness was thin. A bad harvest, a debt unpaid, or an illness could lead to eviction. The poor laws of England, particularly after the 13th century, began to categorize the deserving and undeserving poor. Those who could work but didn't were viewed with suspicion, often punished or forced to leave town. Those who tried to sleep under the stars, of necessity were sometimes treated as criminals. And yet, despite these challenges, outdoor sleeping formed a quiet thread in the medieval fabric. It was common enough to be visible, yet silent enough to be largely forgotten by chroniclers. These people left few records-only footprints, perhaps, and the worn impressions of a body on damp stone. One wonders what they dreamed under the open sky. Did they look at the stars with resentment, or did they find some strange comfort in the patterns above? Was it terror or peace that came with nightfall? As night deepened in the medieval towns and countryside, the open-air sleepers settled in, often without conversation, without ceremony. The act of going to sleep was not tied to bedtime routines, soft pillows, or quiet rooms. It was an act of necessity, closely tied to exhaustion, hunger, or the disappearance of daylight. For those without shelter, the night wasn't a pause. In the day's activity was just another challenge to endure. You might imagine that people simply fell asleep. But for the medieval poor, the process was often far from restful. Their bodies were usually cold, stiff from labor or travel, and rarely well fed. Sleep came in fits. They dozed lightly, often with one eye open, trained on sounds, footsteps, horses, church bells, rustling fabric, or worse. And yet, in time, they slipped into uneasy dreams. In some cases, those dreams were influenced by the life around them. Stories from the time hint that people sleeping outdoors often imagined divine visions, ominous warnings, or encounters with the dead. Perhaps it was the cold, or the hunger, or the night air that sparked these hallucinations. Perhaps it was the silence. In a world with few distractions, one's thoughts often turned inward, and dreams could take on strange shapes. But not all was fear. Many of the poor who slept outdoors developed quiet rituals, ways of making the night more tolerable. Some sang softly to themselves, using lullabies remembered from childhood. Others whispered prayers, asking not just for protection, but for warmth, or for the strength to rise again in the morning. In some towns, the homeless formed loose groups, taking turns watching while others rested. Safety in numbers was not just a saying, it was survival. Then there were the stars. In places with no torches or lanterns, the night sky stretched above, like a ceiling of light. Many medieval people believed the stars carried messages, symbols of fate or God's will. To sleep under them was to place oneself directly beneath the gaze of the heavens. It wasn't always a comfort, but it was a connection. One was small beneath the stars, but also, somehow, seemed odd despite the hardship. There was an odd intimacy in these shared sleeping spaces. A covered alleyway might shelter three strangers, all curled on their sides, facing the same wall. A roadside ditch might hold a traveler, a laborer, and a child with no parents saw, pressed by the same cold, all dreaming in the same dark. These small groups sometimes shared food, stories, or warmth. They rarely shared names, and by dawn, most were gone. What's striking is how little of this life was recorded. Medieval chroniclers wrote of kings and plagues, of castles and battles, but almost never of the nightly migrations of the homeless. They were seen but unmentioned, a part of the background noise of the city, and so their stories slip quietly through the cracks of history. But they were there beneath bridges, beside walls, curled against staircases, sleeping through wind and fog. Theirs was not a glamorous suffering, but a quiet, constant one, and one can't help but wonder, did they ever think of themselves as part of the city? Or did they live always on its edges, awake while others dreamed? As the first pale threads of dawn wove through the streets, the figures who had spent the night exposed to the sky began to stir. There was no rooster's crow to rouse them, no morning bell meant for their ears. Instead, they were woken by the rising murmur of life vendors preparing carts, guards switching shifts, church bells marking matins, and the distant clatter of hooves on stone. For the poor who slept outdoors, mornings were about vanishing. Daylight was not their friend. With it came scrutiny, patrols, judgmental eyes. In many towns, local officials, beadles, constables, or church stewards were tasked with clearing visible signs of poverty before the marketplace filled. They didn't want travelers or townsfolk to see the curled forms of the sleepless poor. On their way to mass or business, the appearance of order mattered, so the sleepers disappeared. Some quietly walked out of town, shoulders hunched, heading toward the fields or woods where day labor might be found. Others drifted to church doors to beg during morning services. A few slipped into the vendor crowds, seeking scraps, coins, or just a moment's warmth beside a cook fire. Often they'd return to the same spot by nightfall. No one else had claimed it. This daily cycle find shelter, sleep uneasily, vanish continued for many, day after day, season after season. In wealthier cities, charitable institutions sometimes offered morning bread or watered ale, especially during holy seasons. But those options were limited and often came with strings attached: prayers, labor, obedience. Not everyone was welcomed, and not everyone chose to be. In the countryside, things were quieter, but not necessarily easier. Travelers, peasants without land, or those displaced by war or debt often slept along roadsides or in abandoned sheds. Trees became walls, fallen leaves became bedding. The night sounds were different: wolves, owls, insects, but the vulnerability remained. A person who slept too deeply risked being robbed, trampled by carts, or worse. And yet, even in this harsh rhythm, there were moments of resilience. A shoeless man might walk 50 miles for a chance at fieldwork. A child abandoned by parents might survive by attaching herself to a group of pilgrims. People formed bonds that lasted a night, a week, or a lifetime, friendships born in alleys and on cold stone steps. There were no records of these connections, no portraits, just worn hands, hoarse voices, and the endurance of those who had no place but still found ways to live. By the late Middle Ages, laws tightened. Vagrancy acts criminalized sleeping in public spaces. Some towns built poorhouses, others simply expelled the homeless to nearby villages. The church's view of charity shifted from spiritual duty to regulated control. Sleeping under the stars became not just difficult, but illegal. And yet, people still did it. Today, the image of a person sleeping outside is no longer tied to medieval towns, but the reality endures. The reasons have changed: urbanization, housing crises, displacement, but the rhythm remains. Nightfall, shelter-seeking, survival, disappearance. History rarely records the lives of the unsheltered, but if you listen closely, the echo is still there, in every alley, under every bridge, beneath every sky. A quiet reminder that not all who sleep under stars do so by choice. Maybe that's the question history leaves us with. Why do we so often forget the people who had no roof? Imagine ending your day not on a mattress or even a modest cot, but on a sack stuffed with straw laid over a wooden platform more directly on the earthen floor. In medieval Europe, sleep wasn't shaped by preference, but by class. climate, and necessity. The idea of bedding covered a wide range of arrangements. For the wealthy, beds were symbols of status as much as tools for rest. For the poor, sleeping surfaces were improvised from whatever was available: straw, moss, or even leaves. Let's begin at the top. Noble households often had elaborate wooden bed frames, raised off the floor and carved with detail. These beds were theatrical as well as functional. Lords and ladies slept on thick feather mattresses laid over rope or wooden slats. Wool or linen sheets were layered, topped with fur throws or richly dyed blankets. Pillows weren't just for heads, they cushioned knees or lined the sides, creating a soft cocoon. Most important was the canopy, a frame above the bed draped with heavy curtains. These were not just decorative. In large, cold stone rooms, curtains helped trap heat and offer privacy. A bed could feel like a small room within a room, a place not only for sleep, but for recovery from illness or receiving guests. In some royal courts, people were formally received in bedchambers, not audience halls, but this luxury was rare. Most people, peasants, laborers, servants, slept on much humbler setups. Many used a tick, a cloth sack filled with straw, hay, or reeds, placed on a wooden frame or directly on the ground. During harvest season, straw was fresh and free, but over time it flattened, grew moldy, and attracted bugs. Families often slept together for warmth. One straw bed might serve parents and children alike. In winter, animals like pigs or goats were sometimes kept indoors, sharing body heat and space with the family. Middle-class homes had slightly better arrangements. Craftsmen or merchants might afford a wooden bed with a mattress filled with wool, horsehair, or moss. These materials held heat better and were longer lasting than straw, but they were harder to clean. Lice and fleas were common, and bedding was rarely washed. In colder areas like northern Europe, extra layers helped fight off the chill. For pelts, sheepskins, or woven mats added insulation. In warmer climates, lighter mats or blankets on wooden frames were typical. Beds were so valued that they appeared in wills and dowries. A feather bed might be a household's most prized possession, not just furniture, but a sign of wealth and comfort. A decent bed could outlast its owner. So how did medieval people sleep without memory foam or modern linens? Simply on whatever they had. Comfort was a matter of degree. Warmth was everything. And the bed, whether a grand feather nest or a musty straw sack, was not just for sleep, but for survival. When you think of a bed today, you likely imagine a neatly made mattress layered with sheets, pillows, and maybe a blanket or two. But in the medieval world, the idea of bed materials was entirely shaped by necessity, geography, and economics, not aesthetics. Let's begin with the most common and accessible bedding material, straw. After every harvest, peasants collected the leftover stalks of wheat, barley, or rye. These were dried and bundled to form the stuffing for tick-cloth sacks that served as rudimentary mattresses. But straw was not particularly comfortable. It flattened quickly, retained moisture in damp climates, and was prone to attracting insects like lice and fleas. Over time, it began to smell musty, especially in homes without proper ventilation or with animals nearby. For those who could afford a slight upgrade, hay was preferred over straw. Though more expensive and needed as animal feed, hay was softer and provided better insulation. Still, it was far from ideal. Hay could mold if not properly dried and had to be replaced frequently, meaning most families only refreshed it when absolutely necessary. In the middle tiers of society, artisans, small merchants, or successful farmers, you might find mattresses stuffed with wool, moss, or horsehair. Each of these had its benefits and drawbacks. Wool retained heat well and was more durable than straw, but it was expensive and vulnerable to moths. Moss was easy to gather from forests, especially in northern regions, but it compacted quickly and didn't last long. Horsehair, surprisingly effective, was coarse but resilient, and it allowed air to circulate, reducing moisture buildup. Was often used in higher-end bedding well into the modern period. Among the wealthy, feather and down mattresses represented the pinnacle of comfort. These were filled with goose or duck feathers, daily the soft underfeathers known as down. Beds stuffed with these materials were not only warmer and softer, but also signified affluence. The cost of gathering and preparing enough feathers to fill a mattress was considerable. As such, feather beds were often mentioned in wills, carefully passed down to heirs. Blankets, too, were made from whatever was locally available. Wool was common, even among the poor, because of its warmth and availability from sheep. Wealthier families might use fur pelts, such as fox or squirrel, sewn together to create thick covers. In colder regions, layering was essential. People slept under multiple blankets, cloaks, or animal skins to keep warm. Interestingly, linen sheets were a luxury item. Linen was difficult and time-consuming to produce. It required harvesting flax, retting the stalks, combing the fibers, and weaving the threads. For this reason, owning a set of linen sheets indicated a high level of social standing. Many households didn't use sheets at all and slept directly on their bedding material. In some cases, dried leaves, seaweed, or heather were used as mattress filler in coastal or forested areas. These materials were often free and easy to replace, though they provided little in the way of comfort. Cleaning was another matter altogether. Mattresses were rarely washed. Instead, their contents were sometimes emptied, aired out, and refilled. This was usually done in spring or early summer, when weather allowed for drying and fewer infestations. Most peasants, however, simply endured flattened, dusty, and buggy bedding for months or years, and end as we trace the texture of medieval sleep. From coarse horsehair to damp straw, it's clear that people found ways to rest with whatever materials they could gather. But materials were only one part of the story. What about where people actually slept? What did sleeping arrangements look like across homes, families, and social roles? In medieval life, where you slept and with whom was as important as what you slept on. A person's sleeping arrangement reflected social status, household size, and daily labor more than comfort or privacy. Let's start with the most common scenario: shared sleeping spaces. For peasants and lower-class families, the home was usually a one-room dwelling. There was no concept of a bedroom. Parents, children, and sometimes extended family all slept in the same space, often on shared bedding laid on the floor, or low wooden platforms. In winter, livestock like pigs, goats, or chickens might also sleep indoors for warmth. Adding to the body heat and the noise, beds were functional, not personal. A single straw mattress or hay sack might sleep several people, side by side. The idea of privacy was foreign to most medieval minds. Sleep was communal, necessary, and practical. Sleeping alone was often a privilege reserved for monks, widows, or nobles, not a choice. In wealthier homes, multiple rooms allowed for some separation. A master and mistress might share a feather bed, while servants slept nearby on pallets or benches. In castles, High-status individuals sometimes had private bedchambers, but even then, servants might sleep on the floor or in adjoining spaces. Warmth was always a concern. Thick stone walls were cold in winter, and fireplaces could only do so much. Sleeping close helped conserve heat in manors and royal households. The bedroom could also serve as a social space. Guests were sometimes received while the noble lay in bed, dressed formally, propped up by embroidered pillows. It was both a show of status and a practicality in drafty halls. Canopy beds with curtains weren't just decorative. They created small pockets of warmth in otherwise open rooms. Among lower classes, sleep followed the rhythm of labor. Farmers rose before dawn, and rest came in stretches, sometimes in shifts. Servants or apprentices might sleep on mats, benches, or under tables. In inns or travelers' lodges, strangers often shared beds, a practice known as bed sharing. Though odd to us now, it was economical. Several travelers of the same sex might sleep in one bed to save space and warmth. Interestingly, bedfellows weren't always strangers. In royal courts or among scholars, sharing a bed could build trust, friendship, or alliances. It didn't always suggest intimacy, it might signal status or companionship. Children rarely had their own beds. They slept with siblings, parents, or in cribs near the family bed. In crowded homes, floor space was limited, and sleep had to adapt around daily life. Some households used shifts, especially in towns where nighttime labor like baking or watchkeeping common. Even monasteries varied. Monks often had individual cells with narrow beds or wooden planks, but communal dormitories were also common. Silence was enforced, and bedding was minimal: straw mattresses, thin blankets, and often no pillows. Sleep was spiritual discipline, not comfort. Reflecting on medieval sleeping arrangements shows that beds were more than places to rest. They revealed class, community, and survival. Whether curled up in a haystack, stretched across a feather bed, or huddled on straw, people made do. And it leaves us wondering, in an age without privacy, springs, or pillows, did people feel rest? Imagine going to bed each night not in solitude, but side by side with siblings, strangers, or even traveling merchants. In medieval and early modern history, sleeping alone was a rarity, not a norm. The idea of a private bedlet, alone a private bedroom, simply didn't exist for the vast majority of people. For peasants, artisans, and even many urban dwellers, a shared sleeping arrangement was part of daily life. Beds were expensive, space was limited, and warmth was a communal effort. A family might have only one bed or no bed at all. In such homes, everyone, regardless of age or gender, slept together for survival more than comfort. The primary reason for sharing beds was practical: warmth. In cold climates and poorly insulated homes, body heat was one of the only reliable ways to stay warm at night. A single person in a large, drafty room would be vulnerable to illness or exposure. Sleeping with others created a microclimate bubble of warmth that could mean the difference between health and sickness. In rural cottages, it was common for parents to sleep with children, and for older siblings to share a mattress, often laid directly on the floor. Sleeping head to foot, alternating the direction of sleepers, was sometimes done to save space and minimize contact. Blankets and cloaks were shared, and if livestock were indoors, their body heat also added to the overall warmth. But shared sleeping wasn't just confined to families. In taverns and inns, travelers frequently found themselves paired with complete strangers. This wasn't seen as odd, it was a necessity. Inns often had far fewer beds than guests, so the practice of bed sharing developed. Men would be placed with men, women with women, and children would squeeze in wherever there was room. Privacy was not expected. Curtains, if available, were for warmth, not modesty. Even in royal courts and elite circles, bed sharing had its place. Servants commonly slept at the foot of their master's bed or nearby on the floor. In many noble households, high-ranking individuals would invite guests or companions to share a bed, not as a sign of intimacy, but as an indication of trust and favor. Sharing a bed could even be political. In the Tudor court, being invited to sleep alongside the king was a privilege, not a scandal. Among apprentices and journeymen, shared bedding was part of their lodging arrangement. Multiple young workers might sleep in a single bed, either provided by their master or arranged in a shared dormitory. In boarding schools, monasteries, and military barracks, rows of simple beds or straw pallets lined the walls, and sleep was highly regimented. Silence was expected, comfort was not. And then there were the truly poor, the vagrants, laborers, or servants who had no beds at all. They might sleep in barns, stables, or under open skies, curled beside others for warmth and protection. In some towns, flophouses offered a piece of floor or a shared blanket for a small fee. In cities, people crammed into tenements might sleep in shifts, using the same space at different times of day. This world of shared beds reveals a vastly different relationship to sleep on, where survival trumped solitude. Personal space was a luxury, and a warm body next to yours was a necessity. But what happened when people had no one to sleep beside? How did society treat those who had no shared warmth, no bedding, and no protection? As we move deeper into the past, we begin to see that shared sleeping wasn't only about warmth and necessity, was also a deeply social experience, one that reflected customs, class boundaries, and unspoken rules of closeness. In many households, sleeping beside someone wasn't just a fact of life, it was a ritual of trust and familiarity. Within families, it helped reinforce bonds. Children not only slept with siblings, but also sometimes with parents or grandparents, especially in times of illness or mourning. For the very young, falling asleep to the sound of shared breath was a comfort. For the elderly, being surrounded by family in the dark hours offered protection and companionship. In early modern Europe, bed sharing could also be practical training. A mother might teach her daughter sewing or prayers while lying together in the evenings. Apprentices, when not crowded into workshop floors or garrets, might share beds to exchange knowledge and gossip after long days of labor. It was during these quiet hours, pressed shoulder to shoulder, that much oral tradition, songs, recipes, folk knowledge was passed down. And yet not all bed sharing was equal. Among the upper classes, the symbolism of the bed became more complex. For nobles and monarchs, beds were no longer just for sleeping. They became thrones, stages, and even battlefields of politics. It wasn't uncommon for members of a court to be granted the privilege of the bedchamber, which meant access to the ruler's private sleeping area. Sharing a bed with a monarch, even briefly, could signal favor, elevate status, or seal an alliance. Take, for instance, the peculiar custom of honorary bedfellows. In certain courts, young male courtiers were allowed or instructed to sleep beside a noble or royal figure. Far from scandalous, it was often seen as a mark of elite trust, and in some circles, even a rite of passage, while modern sensibilities may interpret such closeness differently. At the time, it was rooted in layered codes of loyalty, secrecy, and service. Meanwhile, the poor and landless had a different kind of sleeping experience, one marked not by ritual, but by exposure. Those without family or home often relied on public charity or religious institutions for a place to sleep. Almshouses, convents, and monasteries might offer a hard bench or floor space, usually shared among many. In urban areas, laborers sometimes paid for access to a shared bed by the hour, rotating in and out in shifts. These arrangements were not only impersonal, but deeply vulnerable. Theft, lice, or worse, were constant risks. In some cases, people built sleeping benches into the walls of homes, where multiple family members could sleep side by side but separated slightly by boards or elevation. Others used wide, box-like cupboard beds, especially in colder regions like Scotland or the Netherlands. These wooden enclosures offered more privacy and insulation, but were still built for 2 or more sleepers. There were also taboos and etiquette around bed sharing. Certain combinations, like unrelated men and women, were generally frowned upon unless necessary. In religious communities, strict rules applied. Monks and nuns might sleep in shared dormitories, but always fully clothed and spaced apart, even among the poor. Unspoken rules governed how you positioned yourself beside another sleeper. Facing away was polite, and knees were best kept to oneself, as you lie in your own bed, separated from the world by walls and quiet its worth. Imagining what it meant to live a life where closeness was constant, where nighttime was never truly private, and the presence of another breathing body was a fact of survival, not choice. But what happens when cultures begin to push back against this closeness? When solitude starts to become a sign of wealth or even virtue? By the late 17th and into the 18th century, something interesting began to happen. People started wanting to sleep alone. Not everywhere, and not all at once, but gradually. Ideas about privacy, modesty, and solitude began to change. What had once been normal shared sleeping started to feel uncomfortable, especially among the rising middle class. One major reason was a shift in how people thought about the body. Enlightenment thinking encouraged viewing the body not just as a tool for labor, but as something private. This filtered into daily life. Cleanliness became a moral issue. Modesty mattered more. Sharing a bed with a stranger or even a sibling started to feel improper in polite society. Architecture also evolved. Wealthy families moved into homes with multiple rooms. Georgian townhouses, for instance, had parlors, kitchens, servant quarters, and separate bedrooms. Privacy became something to show off. Having your own room and bed signaled status and refinement. Beds themselves changed. Earlier, they were large and built for multiple people, with high headboards and curtains to keep out cold. But as private sleep gained value, smaller, more personal beds became fashionable. Working class people still shared, but the ideal was shifting toward solitude. Religious influences mattered too. In Protestant and Puritan communities, modesty and restraint were deeply valued. Sleep wasn't just rest, it was part of your moral life. Parents were told to monitor sleeping arrangements. Religious leaders discouraged bed sharing between unmarried people. Even some married couples began sleeping separately for reasons of health or discipline. By the 19th century, new ideas about health added more pressure. As doctors linked shared sleeping with disease tuberculosis, typhoid, sleeping apart was seen as not just proper, but safer. Still, shared beds didn't disappear overnight. Poor families in cities and rural communities around the world continued sleeping together well into the 20th century. In many cultures today, communal sleeping is still the norm and cherished for its closeness. Yet in much of the modern Western world, sleep has become a private ritual. One bed, one person, one room. Sleep aids like earplugs, white noise machines, and sleep apps reinforce this solitary norm. We've moved from crowded hay piles to memory foam and smart beds. But with that comfort have we lost something? The warmth, the closeness, the quiet connection of shared sleep. Maybe the strangest thing is this. In beds that once held many, why do so many now feel alone? In the stillness of a medieval evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows lengthened across cobbled streets and fields, a low, steady sound would ripple through the air. The church bell, not a call to worship or warning of danger this time, but a signal known as the curfew bell. Its purpose, to remind everyone that it was time to put out their fires, secure their homes, and begin preparing for sleep. The word curfew itself comes from the old French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire, and while today it's often associated with restrictions on movement, in its original sense, it was very literally a bedtime bell. Church bells structured the lives of people in medieval Europe, and sleep, like work and worship, followed there. Lead. Daily life in a typical village or town was synchronized by these tolls. Bells rang for morning prayers, midday breaks, vespers, and evening wind downs. Monasteries followed even stricter routines, with bells summoning monks to matins, lauds, prime, and more 7 or 8 intervals of prayer that cut across the full 24-hour day. These monastic schedules influenced the surrounding communities, creating a shared sense of time even in a world without clocks. For mostly people, the evening bell was a final instruction. Fires were dangerous in timber homes with thatched roofs, and without modern fire suppression, an unattended hearth could destroy an entire village. When the curfew bell rang, people placed an iron lid or damp cloth over the embers, preventing accidental ignition. After that, the home grew dark and gradually quiet. This imposed rhythm wasn't just about safety, it helped define the cultural understanding of night and sleep. There were no electric lights, and candles were expensive. Once darkness settled in, there was little to do that didn't involve storytelling, prayer, or simple domestic tasks. The bell marked the shift from work to rest, from activity to stillness. In towns and cities, the bell served another function. It cleared the streets. After curfew, movement outside could be restricted. In some places, watchmen were allowed to challenge or detain people found wandering after hours. The nighttime world was considered mysterious, dangerous, and spiritually charged. By signaling when to retreat indoors, the church bell reinforced both safety and religious discipline. For many, bedtime began with evening prayers. Families might recite psalms together or whisper personal petitions to saints. Some believed that demons or restless spirits roamed the world at night, especially in liminal spaces between dusk and dawn. The best defense was to fall asleep in a state of grace, soul quieted, heart humbled. Interestingly, in some regions, a second bell rang later in the night to wake monastics or remind the devout of midnight vigils. In rare cases, the bell also served to punctuate segmented sleep, a natural rhythm where people slept in 2 parts, waking briefly around midnight for prayer, conversation, or even chores before returning to rest. But bells were not uniform across Europe. The customs of England might differ from those in the Low Countries or the Italian states. And in rural regions far from churches, families followed natural cues: the setting sun, the quieting animals, the darkening hearth. Still, for much of medieval Europe, sleep was not just a biological act, it was a religious event, framed by sound, ritual, and sacred timing. But how did this blend of faith and routine shape the very way people understood dreams, nightmares, and what happened to the soul while the body slept? As medieval people closed their eyes to sleep, they didn't simply think of it as rest. They believed they were entering another realm, one deeply tied to their spiritual condition. The transition from waking to sleeping was not only physical, but also moral, emotional, and divine. It was in sleep that the soul wandered, and where the unseen world became more visible. In the theology of the time, sleep was a vulnerable state. The body was inactive, but the soul, untethered by the senses, was thought to drift, capable of encountering visions, temptations, or divine messages. The boundary between the real and the spiritual blurred. That's why evening prayers were so crucial. A soul unprepared for sleep might, according to popular belief, be more open to demonic attack or sinful dreams. Dreams were not simply seen as random images of the subconscious. They were messages, sometimes from God, other times from darker forces. Medieval texts are full of references to warning dreams, satanic dreams, and prophetic dreams. In monasteries, dreams might be discussed seriously the next day, especially if they were vivid or unsettling. Saints' lives often included tales of nighttime visions that revealed spiritual truths or foretold future events. But dreams could also be dangerous. Lustful dreams, for instance, were a common source of anxiety for monks and nuns, especially because they seemed uncontrollable. Even involuntary nighttime emissions were considered troubling, often requiring confession. Church doctrine wrestled with the difference between involuntary sin and willful thought, and the line was never entirely clear. In some cases, sleep became a spiritual battleground. The devil, it was believed, preyed on the sleeping just as he tempted the waking. This led to the widespread use of protective measures. People hung crosses or relics above their beds, sprinkled holy water around the room, or placed prayer books and psalters on pillows. In wealthier homes, bed curtains weren't only for warmth. They were believed to keep evil spirits at bay. This fear was not entirely abstract. Nightmares were often interpreted as spiritual warnings or demonic oppression. One common medieval belief was in the incubuser, male demon who attacked women in their sleep, and its female counterpart, the succubus. These creatures were blamed for sleep paralysis, erotic dreams, and even unexplained pregnancies. Physicians and clergy alike debated the causes, often landing somewhere between natural humors and supernatural forces. Meanwhile, saints and holy people were thought to receive divine dreams. Joan of Arc claimed her visions began at night, and many mystics wrote extensively about the spiritual revelations they received while sleeping. To them, the night was a sacred window into God's will. Sleep was not an interruption to holiness. Sit was part of it. Children were taught bedtime prayers as spiritual armor. A popular rhyme went, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, bless the bed that I lie on. The presence of saints was imagined as a shield, watching over the sleeper until morning. In a world where death could come suddenly even in the night, this was not mere poetry. Many people went to bed uncertain if they would wake again. Thus, the medieval sleeper was never truly alone. Whether surrounded by family, monks, or saint saw, troubled by inner fears and invisible foes. The sleeping body remained part of the cosmic drama of salvation and sin. But what happened when the bell failed to ring, when prayers were forgotten, or when the line between sleep and death became too thin to recognize? In the medieval world, the line between sleep and death was thin, almost transparent. The Church often spoke of sleep as a metaphor for dying, and death as a form of final rest. Graves were resting places, and the dead were said to be asleep in the Lord. Tombs bore carvings of peaceful, reclining figures, eyes closed, hands folded as, if only napping. But this wasn't just poetic. It reflected a serious concern. What if you died in your sleep unprepared? Life in medieval times was fragile. Plague, war, childbirth, or simple illness could take a person suddenly. Sleep, with its stillness and vulnerability, looked too much like death. That's why people worked to sleep well, not in comfort, but in grace. Nightly prayers, a last confession, a moment of forgiveness before bed, these weren't just habits. They might be your final acts. This fear was especially strong for the sick. If someone neared death, family and clergy gathered. Final prayers were said. A priest gave last rites. Friends offered goodbyes. If the person fell unconscious before the rites could be finished, it was feared their soul might be lost. To die in your sleep without confession, a terrifying fate. It meant facing eternity unready. Yet not all sleep was feared. Some longed for it. Holy men and women sometimes prayed for death in sleep, gentle, silent, and free of pain. Saints were described as falling asleep in peace, watched over by angels, or gifted with final visions. Sleep was the quiet doorway to eternity. Tombstone carvings reflected this hope. Here lies so-and-so, who fell asleep in Christ, was a common inscription. It offered comfort. The body had died, but the soul was merely resting, awaiting resurrection. This blending of sleep and death even shaped church architecture. Monastic dormitories were simple and symbolic. Monks slept in rows, dressed in robes that also served as burial clothes. Some were buried in the very garments they wore to bed. The dormitory was often next to the chapelles, if to remind them they were always sleeping in the presence of God. And then there was the bell. In monasteries and towns, church bells marked the passing of time, but they also marked the passing of life. Bells tolled at death during funerals, and even in early morning hours, calling not just the living, but perhaps the souls of the departed. Today, we fall asleep to the buzz of devices and the glow of screens. But in medieval times, sleep was sacred, a slow drift, not only into dreams, but perhaps into eternity. So one might ask, when did sleep stop being holy? And what did we lose when the bells stopped ringing? Imagine a winter night in a medieval village. The wind hisses through the wooden slats of a poorly insulated cottage. Outside, frost crusts the ground, and the darkness stretches for hours. In such a world, the fire glowing softly in the hearth is not just comforting, it is essential for survival. For many medieval people, especially peasants and those living in rural areas, the fireplace was the center of life. It provided heat, light, and a place to cook food. But more than that, it offered the only real chance at staying warm through long, bitter nights. Sleeping near the fire was not a luxury, it was often a necessity. The hearth sat in the middle of the home or against one wall, sometimes surrounded by rough stone or clay. There were no modern chimneys in the early Middle Ages. Smoke simply drifted upward and escaped through a hole in the roof or didn't. Many cottages were perpetually smoky, and people learned to live with soot-covered walls and lungs that stung from constant inhalation. Still, the heat of the fire was worth the discomfort. Sleeping beside the fire came with practical benefits. Children, the elderly, and the sick were often placed closest to the warmth. People might sleep on benches, straw mats, or directly on the dirt floor, wrapping themselves in wool fur, or anything available. A family might crowd together with livestock tucked in the corner for added body heat. In such tight quarters, the fire's flicker was a silent guardian, pushing back against the cold. But it also brought risks. A fire left burning overnight could easily spark disaster. It wasn't uncommon for embers to flare up and ignite thatched roofs, blankets, or wooden beams. Entire homes were lost this way. And so, caution was part of the bedtime ritual. Coals were banked carefully covered with ash to smolder safely. In some households, one person was assigned to wake occasionally and check the fire through the night. Others kept pots of water nearby, just in case. The heat, too, was uneven. Those closest to the fire might sweat and struggle to breathe, while those further away shivered under thin covers. Sleeping beside the hearth was a skilled, delicate balance between warmth and danger. Turn to close, and your clothes might smolder. Turn away, and you'd wake up with frozen feet. Over time, fire-related superstitions grew. In some regions, it was believed that evil spirits could emerge from the fire at night if it wasn't blessed or watched. Others thought that the hearth, if kept burning all night, could bring bad luck unless prayers were said. The fire, though familiar, was never entirely tame. Still, for millions of people across centuries, the hearthside remained the coziest, safest place to sleep, even if it meant coughing through smoke, worrying about sparks, or waking stiff from the cold stone floor. But as fires burned low and homes turned silent, a question always lingered in the smoke-filled air. What if the fire went out before dawn? Keeping the fire alive through the night wasn't just a matter of comfort, it was an act of responsibility and often a shared duty. In many medieval households, especially in colder regions, firekeeping was as essential as milking cows or baking bread. Without a warm fire, waking up could mean waking to frostbitten fingers, cracked lips, and dangerously cold air that could make even breathing painful. Fires were not relit every morning from scratch, because fire-starting tools were not always reliable. Flint and steel were slow. Matches didn't exist. Instead, families relied on banked embers, a practice where the hot coals were carefully covered with ash before bed. This allowed them to smolder gently through the night. Come morning, one could remove the ash and gently fan the fire back to life if, that is, the embers had survived. This is where the role of the night watcher or firekeeper became important. In some households, an older child, servant, or even an elderly grandparent might be tasked with waking once or twice during the night to check the fire. This task wasn't glamorous. It meant leaving a warm blanket or sometimes a straw pile wandering across a dark, cold room and poking through embers with a stick or iron rod. If the fire had nearly died, the firekeeper would stir it, add a bit of kindling, and rebuild the protective ash dome. This process required knowledge. Too much air and the fire would flare dangerously. Too little and it would die completely. A well-tended fire could last from sundown to sunrise, a quiet triumph of patience and skill. In wealthier homes, firekeeping might fall to a servant who stayed in the kitchen quarters or near the hearth, sleeping lightly. In castles or monasteries, where the fire warmed not just a family but an entire household or group of monks. Large hearths were maintained all night, their flames a sign of stability and provision. Night waking didn't just serve the fire. For many, waking in the middle of the night was a normal part of the sleep cycle. People often slept in two phases, what historians now call first sleep and second sleep. Between these phases was a period of wakefulness, usually lasting 1 or 2 hours. During this time, people might pray, reflect, tend to the fire, or even quietly talk with others sharing the room. Some even believed that the period between sleeps was spiritually potent, the time when the mind was most relaxed, the heart most open to God. Waking to check the fire could thus blend seamlessly into a short prayer, a whispered conversation, or a moment of quiet thought before returning to the blankets. But what if no one checked the fire? If the embers died, the consequences could be serious. In extreme cold, a fireless home could become unbearable. Worse, if the fire flared unexpectedly, catching on stray fabric or dry rushes strewn on the floor, it could mean disaster before anyone woke. So each night, long after the last meal was eaten and the house fell silent, at least one pair of eyes would open in the dark, peer into the hearth, and quietly keep watch. This task, repetitive, thankless, and often forgotten, was one of the small, invisible labors that helped families survive winter after winter. Still, one has to wonder how many homes, in the deep silence of night, woke too late to a fire already lost or already spreading. For all the warmth and comfort that the hearth brought, sleeping beside it remained a constant gamble. While many people managed the risks with skill and tradition, others were not so lucky. Across centuries, hearthside sleep carried with it one of the oldest and most terrifying dangers of all: fire itself. In homes where the floor was strewn with dry straw, rushes, or hay, one rogue ember could spell disaster. Blankets were often made of wool or linen, flammable if caught too close to a flame, and wooden beams, dried out from years of exposure to smoke and heat, made excellent kindling. Fires that started at night often spread before anyone noticed. By the time someone stirred from sleep, it might already be too late. Some written records from the 13th to 16th centuries contain grim accounts of entire homes burning down in the dead of night. Parish registers noted unexpected deaths by burning, and some towns began issuing regulations about how to safely tend household fires after dusk. In certain areas of Europe, nightly curfews were marked by the sound of a bell known as the coverfire or curfew, a signal to smother the hearth and prepare for sleep. This term would later evolve into the modern word curfew. But even when the fire didn't destroy the home, there were subtler dangers. Smoke inhalation was a silent killer. In closed spaces with poor ventilation, the smoke from a poorly maintained fire could collect near the floor, exactly where people lay sleeping. With no chimneys in early medieval homes, the smoke clung to ceilings and walls, staining everything and slowly damaging lungs. Chronic coughing, respiratory illness, and even early death were common side effects of a lifetime spent sleeping beside the flames. And yet, people continued to sleep near the fire because there wasn't really an alternative. Bedrooms were unheated, and in most peasant homes, the bedroom was the main room. The hearth was the only source of life-sustaining heat. For those with infants, keeping the baby near the warmth of the fire could mean the difference between survival and frostbite. For the elderly, it could mean waking with less pain in their joints. Some families developed informal safety rules. No one would sleep with their back directly to the fire. Blankets were kept away from the open flame. Children were always placed furthest from the hearth. Fire dogs and iron grates, where available, added small protections. But there was no such thing as total safety-only habits born from generations of trial and error. Even in wealthier homes with better fireplaces and chimneys, the risk was never fully eliminated. Fires could still spark, chimneys could clog, and smoke could backfill into rooms. Candles left burning on wooden tables added yet another hazard. In cities like London or Paris, entire neighborhoods were vulnerable to a single household fire, especially in crowded timber-framed streets. And yet, the hearthside remained a place of comfort. There was something timeless about lying next to a glowing fire, feeling its warmth on one side and the cold creeping in on the other. The crackling sound became a kind of lullaby. For many medieval people, sleep by the fire was the closest they ever came to feeling secure in the end. It was this strange balance that defined hearthside sleep. Comfort wrapped in danger, rest wrapped in vigilance. A life built around the fire meant living with both its light and its shadow. And as the world modernized, as chimneys rose and stoves replaced open flames, one wonders, did something quietly vanish along with the smoke? The night has deepened now. Everything feels slower, softer. Maybe there's a gentle breeze outside your window, or just the quiet hum of a fan turning, the last drip of tea in your cup. Somewhere, someone has fallen asleep with a book resting. On their chest, a single lamp glowing warm in the dark. Stories like these don't rush, they settle, I wonder. Have you ever felt something so quietly it stayed with you? No need to answer. But if anything surfaced, the comment box is still there, a soft place at the edge of sleep. Now then, let's return. Weird sleep habits of medieval people and more. If you were to walk the stone-paved streets of Constantinople during the height of the Byzantine Empire, especially after sunset, you might expect to find darkness and silence. Instead, what you'd discover would feel surprisingly alive. Despite the absence of electric lights, despite the dangers of the night, Constantinople never truly slept. The rhythms of its citizens were as layered and complex as the city itself. Sleep in Byzantine Constantinople was fragmented. Much like in many pre-modern societies, the idea of a full, uninterrupted 8 hours of rest was foreign. People slept in intervals, first sleep followed by waking hours, then a second sleep. But what set Constantinople apart was how much activity continued around the edges of night. Religious devotion, street vendors, palace intrigue, and even medical advice played a part in shaping the city's unusual sleep culture. In part, this sleeplessness was by design. Constantinople was the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire, and it pulsed with life 24 hours a day. Church bells, not clocks, marked time. The city's many churches, including the great Hagia Sophia, called the faithful to prayer not just during the day, but in the darkest hours of the night. Monks and devout citizens often woke before dawn to attend liturgies. This constant religious schedule contributed to interrupted sleep. Patton's rest was a spiritual rhythm as much as a physical one. The presence of markets and taverns also extended the city's hours. Although large bazaars shut by sundown, street food vendors lingered. Some sold hot lentils or wine to late working laborers or travelers. Inns near the harbor stayed open deep into the night, receiving sailors from distant lands. Pilgrims arrived by boat at all hours. Merchants unloaded cargo in the moonlight. The docks rarely slept. Inside homes, things were just as busy. The average citizen might be awake in the middle of the night, tending to a sick child, checking the oil lamp, or even stepping outside to fetch water. Wealthier households had slaves or servants to do these tasks, but even they slept in shifts, always partially alert in case their master summoned them. Byzantine medical texts from the period even described insomnia in detail. Physicians recognized restlessness as a condition, often recommending herbal remedies like vinegar baths or chamomile for relief. But they didn't see sleeplessness as entirely negative. In fact, waking at night was seen as an opportunity to pray, to reflect, or to write. Monks translated scriptures during these quiet hours. Scholars copied texts. Some emperors were rumored to hold secret nighttime meetings when the city was hushed and eavesdroppers were few. Of course, the city also had its share of nocturnal threats. Fires could break out easily in tightly packed neighborhoods. Thieves, though punished severely when caught, still lurked in dark alleyways. Guards patrolled the city walls and streets, lighting torches and ringing bells to signal the passage of each hour. Even so, fear rarely kept the people indoors. So what kept Constantinople's people from sleeping deeply or soundly, like many imagined the pre-modern world did? Was it religious fervor, urban noise, practical necessity, or perhaps the city itself, with its layers of history and movement, trained its people to live in a state between wakefulness and sleep? One thing is clear: in Constantinople, the night was not a pause in life, but simply another chapter in its continuous unfolding. As the moon rose over the domes and towers of Constantinople, the city entered a different kind of wakefulness. Though shadows lengthened and lanterns flickered in the breeze, life after dark in the Byzantine capital was not defined by sleep but by quiet activity, spiritual routine, and careful vigilance. A key part of this night world was the glow of oil lamps, both humble and grand. In most homes, ceramic or bronze lamps burned olive oil and were tended throughout the night. Their light was faint but steady, casting dancing shadows on walls made of stone and plaster. The wealthy might have ornate silver or gold lamps, suspended from chains or standing tall on carved pedestals. For the poor, even a single flicker of flame was precious. Wick trimming and oil rationing became nightly rituals, as necessary as prayer. Religious devotion was central to this culture of sleeplessness. Monasteries operated on a rigorous schedule of nighttime prayer. The night office, or mesoniktikon, took place around midnight, followed by additional prayers before dawn. Monks, nuns, and the devout laity would rise in darkness, wash their faces, and gather in candlelit chapels to chant psalms. For them, night was not a time of rest, it was sacred, even filled with divine potential. These monastic routines influenced city life more than one might expect. Bells from churches rang out at regular intervals, echoing across the hills and through the narrow streets, acting as a timekeeper for the city's soul. The faithful might pause their sleep to whisper prayers or light a candle. Sleep was no longer an isolated activity, but a fragment of a larger, more spiritual rhythm. But devotion wasn't the only business of the Byzantine night. City watchmen patrolled the streets, calling out the hours and keeping an eye out for fire or criminal activity. Constantinople, with its tightly packed neighborhoods and wooden structures, was always vulnerable to blazes. In fact, some of the city's most destructive fires started late at night, when a lantern tipped or a cooking fire was left untended. That's why certain streets were kept wider than others, not just for traffic, but to act as fire breaks. The government took the danger seriously. A special fire brigade, composed of public slaves or military personnel, was often stationed near key districts. They carried buckets, ladders, and long poles tipped with wet rags. If a fire did break out, bells would ring, watchmen would shout, and citizens might be roused from sleep to form a bucket line. These nightly interruptions became a part of urban reality, a strange blend of rest, readiness, and cooperation. Social life, too, sometimes spilled into the late hours. While most people did not wander far after dark, certain neighborhood taverns and street corners became quiet gathering spots. Men discussed politics, merchants finalized deals with travelers just off the docks, and midwives might be summoned to homes without warning. In wealthier districts, private feasts stretched into the early hours, especially during religious festivals or imperial celebrations. Torches lit courtyards, wine flowed, and musicians played lyres or flutes until the stars began to fade. For the average citizen, night in Constantinople was not so much an escape from the day as it was an extension of it, a time to catch up on tasks, participate in spiritual life, and remain alert to danger. Even within their homes, people rarely felt fully disconnected from the world outside. A shout, a bell, or the smell of smoke could stir an entire household into action. So what did this all mean for rest? Was it restful at all? Or was sleep in Constantinople less about restoration and more about endurance, a pause rather than a refuge? By the time the pale light of dawn rose over the Sea of Marmara, Constantinople was already stirring. For many, sleep had come in short, broken intervals disrupted by prayers, duties, dangers, and the persistent hum of life that never fully paused. What we might call insomnia, the Byzantines accepted as normal. But this chronic wakefulness had real effects in bodies and minds alike. In monasteries, monks often lived into old age, but their health bore the marks of discipline. Rising multiple times each night for prayer drained them. Fatigue was expected, even embraced. Sleeplessness wasn't an illness, it was a form of devotion. To sacrifice sleep was to draw nearer to God. For ordinary people, the story was different. Artisans, laborers, merchants, and guards all struggled to find balance. Homes were small 1 or 2 rooms shared by entire families. Privacy was rare. Silence even rarer. Babies cried, animals stirred, neighbors whispered. The city never truly slept. This fragmented rest often led to exhaustion or irritability, but the symptoms weren't named or pathologized. Byzantine medical texts spoke in vague terms: melancholy, overheating of the blood, wandering of the mind. Treatments were modest: warm milk, lavender baths, or short retreats into silence. Still, Constantinople thrived. Its people were adaptable. The gap between first sleep and second sleep became useful. This quiet middle-of-the-night intervals, sometimes called the watch, was when scholars read, women mended, or families whispered stories in the dark. Even emperors followed this nocturnal rhythm. The court often held private meetings deep in the night, when the world was quieter. It's said that Emperor Constantine VII, known for his scholarship, did much of his writing between midnight and dawn. The silent hours were when thoughts deepened and when decisions moved unseen. But sleep was never just physical. It shaped beliefs. Constantinopolitans lived with a constant sense of spiritual presence in the night. Darkness carried meaning. To remain awake was both duty and protection. As centuries passed and empires shifted, these rhythms softened. But the city remained restless. Even in the Ottoman era, Istanbul's nights echoed with prayers and distant voices, just as they had in the time of Justinian. In the end, sleep in Constantinople was never just about rest. It was a negotiation with faith, fear, and responsibility. The Byzantines lived in a city where one eye stayed open, one ear remained alert, and the soul leaned always toward the flicker of light in the dark. In the quiet darkness of a medieval night, sleep was far from a peaceful escape. It was a vulnerable state, a time when the body rested, but the soul, according to many, was exposed to things beyond the physical world. For the people of the Middle Ages, falling asleep didn't simply mean closing your eyes. It meant opening a door, perhaps unwillingly, to spirits, demons, and otherworldly terrors that lurked beyond the veil of the known. One of the most widely feared creatures associated with sleep was the incubus, a male demon thought to visit women during the night. Its female counterpart, the succubus, was believed to prey on men. These beings weren't imagined in shadows, they were recorded in religious texts, discussed by scholars, and feared by ordinary people. If someone woke up sweating, breathless, or paralyzed, it wasn't chalked up to nightmares or a medical condition, was often blamed on an evil entity pressing down on their chest, stealing their breath, or worse, what we might now call sleep. Paralysis was, in medieval belief, a clear sign of supernatural attack. The weight on the chest, the inability to move or scream, the sense of an invisible present soul were interpreted as visitations by demons or malevolent spirits. Across Europe, many referred to this terrifying sensation as being ridden by the witch or pressed by a night hag. These beliefs weren't just whispered superstitions. They influenced medical theory, church doctrine, and even law. A sudden death during sleep, especially if accompanied by reports of strange dreams or disturbances, could result in a priest being summoned to bless the house. Exorcisms were performed not just for the awake, but also for the bedroom itself. Beds were sprinkled with holy water. Amulets were placed under pillows. Prayers were said at the moment the candle was blown out. It wasn't only demons that troubled sleepers. The medieval mind also feared ghosts, believed to wander restlessly, particularly during the liminal hours of the night. The souls of the unburied or the excommunicated were thought to roam, crying out in anguish or revenge. Monks in some cloisters reported hearing voices at night, often interpreted not as imagination, but as warnings from the spiritual realm. Interestingly, dreams themselves were not always seen as mere nonsense. In many medieval cultures, they were considered messages from God or the devil. A dream could be a test of faith or a sign of spiritual weakness. A nightmare might be a personal failing made manifest in a fearful vision. The line between internal thought and external influence was blurry at best. People took all this very seriously. Night was a sacred and perilous time. Beds were not just furniture, they were spaces of spiritual vulnerability. Every time someone laid their head to rest, they entered a liminal space, halfway between this world and the next. But one can't help but wonder how much of these nightly terrors were truly supernatural, and how much was simply the natural result of illness, fear, or the restless mind of a world without electricity. In a world where the night brought unseen terrors, and every shadow seemed to carry intent, the line between sleep and spiritual warfare became increasingly blurred. For medieval Europeans, protection from nocturnal demons was not just a matter of superstition. It was an essential part of spiritual survival. When nightmares struck, people didn't turn to doctors or healers alone. They turned to saints' prayers, and holy relics to protect their sleep and their souls. One of the most invoked protectors was Saint Michael the Archangel, believed to lead the fight against evil in the unseen realm. Before sleep, many would recite the prayer to Saint Michael, asking for defense against the wickedness and snares of the devil. Some even kept small icons or relics at their bedside to act as spiritual guardians during the vulnerable hours of the night. In monasteries and among the devout, night prayers served as both spiritual practice and protection. The Compline, the final church service of the day in monastic life, often included lines asking God to watch over us while we sleep. For common folk, even simple rhyming blessings spoken aloud before extinguishing the candle were thought to guard against dark forces. Certain herbs and charms also became associated with warding off night demons. Rue, lavender, and rosemary were placed under pillows or hung near sleeping areas to discourage evil spirits. The Church tolerated some of these practices, especially if they were tied to scriptural language. However, many remedies walked a fine line between folk belief and what clergy might label heresy or superstition. People were also taught to interpret dreams with caution. Theologians like St. Augustine and later Thomas Aquinas debated whether dreams were natural or divinely influenced. Worse, sent by the devil. Aquinas proposed that demons could manipulate dreams to tempt the soul or weaken a person's resolve. As such, even what happened in your dreams could affect your perceived spiritual state. In response, detailed rituals evolved around how to cleanse a space where nightmares occurred. If someone was regularly tormented in sleep, it wasn't unusual to bring in a priest to bless the room, sprinkle holy water, and even perform a minor exorcism not on a person, but on the bedroom itself. It was a process rooted in the belief that spiritual impurities clung to the physical space. There were also beliefs surrounding posture and direction of sleep. Some thought sleeping with one's head to the west invited evil, while sleeping to the east toward Jerusalem was spiritually safer. Beds were sometimes oriented accordingly, and if a person died in their sleep following a disturbing nightmare, it was feared their soul had been claimed by dark forces. Perhaps one of the most chilling beliefs was that of the demon of suffocation. This entity was said to sit on the chest of a sleeping victim, making them feel they were being crushed or unable to breathe. Today, we would recognize these as classic symptoms of sleep paralysis. But for medieval people, it was a clear sign that the struggle between good and evil didn't pause just because the eyes were closed. Still, this spiritual dread raises a question that lingers. Were these elaborate protections truly effective? Or did they serve more as comfort against the unknowable forces people felt powerless to fight? As dawn approached and church bells tolled the early morning prayers, medieval sleepers slowly returned from their long, uneasy nights. For some, the night had passed quietly. For others, it was a harrowing journey through dreams and disturbances, shadowy figures and oppressive weights. Whether those terrors were imagined, psychological, or according to beliefreal and spiritual, the fear they inspired was deeply rooted in everyday life, and their legacy has lasted longer than one might expect. Much of what the medieval world feared in sleep has modern names today. Conditions like sleep paralysis, night terrors, and even exploding head syndrome, sudden loud noise in one's head upon waking or falling. A sleeper recognized by medical science. But centuries ago, these symptoms were interpreted not as neurological events, but as spiritual confrontations. The demon pressing on the chest has become a familiar image in historical artwork, famously depicted in 18th and 19th century paintings. showing the lingering cultural power of the medieval night hag myth. Medieval Europe was not the only place where these beliefs existed. Similar traditions appeared in Iceland, the Middle East, West Africa, and East Asia. In Japan, for instance, kanoshibari refers to a ghost or spirit immobilizing a sleeper. In Newfoundland, old hag syndrome described the same paralyzing feeling. This global consistency suggests that the experience of sleep, paralysis or sleep disturbance, is truly ancient, though the explanations have shifted through time. During the Enlightenment and into the 19th century, physicians began challenging supernatural explanations for nightmares. The rise of sleep science offered alternative perspectives, linking sleep disturbances to stress, poor diet, illness, or an overactive imagination. But even as science advanced, many people continued to believe in night spirits, especially in rural areas where folklore passed down through generations maintained its grip. Meanwhile, literature and religious texts preserved the medieval fascination with sleep as a spiritual state. Dante's Divine Comedy, written in the 14th century, often blurs the boundary between dreaming and divine revelation. In the Book of Revelation, visions occur in a dreamlike trance. These stories helped reinforce the idea that the sleeping mind could access things beyond the physical world, whether heavenly or hellish. Today, the idea of sleep demons survives in horror films, ghost stories, and even memes. Despite all our scientific understanding, we still feel uneasy when waking up from a heavy dream, unable to move, heart pounding, convinced something unseen just slipped out of sight. The old fears haven't disappeared, they've simply changed form. And perhaps this is the deeper truth medieval people intuited, that in sleep we are not entirely in control. Something else, be it memory, biology, or imagination, takes over. Whether one believes in demons or not, the experience of being vulnerable in the dark, with the mind conjuring things it cannot explain, remains as real today as it was 1,000 years ago. As you lie in your own bed, far from the wooden frames, feather-stuffed mattresses, and candlelit corners of the medieval world, it's worth reflecting, is the fear of the dark really about what's out there? When you imagine life at sea in the Age of Sail, roughly from the 16th to the mid-19th century, you might picture vast open waters, flapping sails, and the creaking of timber hulls. But beneath the adventure and exploration lay the simple, ongoing challenge of rest. For the sailors aboard these vessels, sleep was not just precious, it was precarious. Ships of the era were anything but comfortable. Whether you were on a merchant vessel, a naval warship, or an exploration ship, sleeping arrangements were dictated by strict hierarchies, limited space, and constant motion. Unlike the wide beds of the wealthy on land, sailors were expected to make do with hammocks, rolls of canvas, or, in the worst cases, bare planks. Privacy was non-existent, space was limited, and the sea never stayed still. Most sailors slept in hammocks slung between beams, which offered a practical advantage. They moved with the motion of the ship. While hammocks could feel unstable to landlubbers, they were actually a clever solution to rolling seas. When hung properly, they prevented sailors from being tossed across the room or rolled onto the deck during rough waters. Hammocks also kept bodies off the damp, rat-infested wooden floors, where water seeped and spilled daily. Sleep schedules at sea followed a strict rotation based on the watch system. Crews were divided into 2 main watches, with each group alternating between 4 hours on duty and 4 hours off. This meant that even if you managed to climb into your hammock, your sleep might be broken every few hours. Continuous rest was a luxury. Most sailors learned to nap when and where they could. Conditions aboard varied depending on the ship, and your rank, officers and captains had private cabins, sometimes with real beds and even windows, but these were still small, cramped, and damp. Ordinary seamen, on the other hand, slept below decks in dark, crowded spaces where air circulation was poor and the smell of salt, sweat, and mildew was constant. The constant rocking of the ship, mixed with the sounds of creaking timber, splashing, waves, barking orders, and the occasional booming of cannons or cargo shifts, made deep sleep difficult. Lighting was minimal, mostly oil lamps, and ventilation was nearly absent. In the tropics, below deck became stifling. In colder regions, it was freezing. And yet, sailors adapted. They had to. Sleep, after all, was as necessary as wind in the sails. Interestingly, hammocks were not just a practical solution, they became symbols of life at sea. Sailors rolled up their hammocks each morning and stowed them away, keeping the deck clear for work. In battle, hammocks were even used as makeshift padding or protection along the rails. And when a sailor died, his hammock sometimes served as his burial shroud, weighted and lowered into the ocean's depths. But how did sailors cope with the psychological strain of fragmented, uncomfortable sleep? What did dreams mean when your bed swayed with every wave and the air was thick with smoke and salt? The ship's bell clanged through the night air, its sound echoing across the decks and below into the gloom of the lower quarters. Time aboard a sailing ship wasn't measured by hours on a clock, but by bells struck every half-hour each, bells marking the end of a 4-hour watch. This rhythm didn't just organize work, it fractured sleep, and in the age of sail, fractured sleep was a fact of life. Sailors lived by the watch system, where crews rotated in and out of duty every 4 hours. This meant no one slept through the night in a single stretch. A sailor might sleep from 8 p.m. to midnight, rise for 4 hours of work, then try to return to sleep at 4 a.m. lonely, to be awakened again by the clamor of ship life or the next bell. This segmented sleep knot, unlike some medieval sleep patterns on land, was standard aboard ship, enforced by necessity rather than custom. You can imagine the toll this routine took. Sleep deprivation was common. Fatigue was constant. And yet, the sea allowed no exceptions. Someone always had to be awake to steer, to navigate, to adjust the sails, to keep watch for storms, pirates, or rocks. In wartime or rough weather, sleep could be skipped entirely for days. A man could fall asleep standing, leaning against a mast, or even while eating. Below deck, the environment added further difficulty. Sailors slept side by side in rows of hammocks, often just inches apart. The air was humid and rank. The ceiling beams were too low to sit up straight, and ventilation was poor. Rats scampered through the timbers. The thumping of waves against the hull and the screech of the ship's timbers were a constant soundtrack. There was no escaping noise or movement. Despite this, sailors adapted in strange and practical ways. Many learned to nap in short bursts, taking advantage of brief moments of calm. Some practiced polyphasic sleep, though they wouldn't have used that term, sleeping in multiple short sessions across the day and night. Others relied on strong coffee, chewing tobacco, or rum to push through periods of exhaustion. Yet, alcohol, especially the daily ration of grog, often interfered with what little sleep they could get. Then there were the dreams. Many sailors recorded strange dreams and visions, some inspired by fear, others by homesickness or the motion of the ship. The rolling of the hammock and the creaking of the deck beneath could weave into one's dreams, making sleep a surreal and sometimes haunting experience. Sailors spoke of hearing voices, seeing long-lost relatives in their sleep, or waking with a start, unsure whether they were at sea or ashore. Maritime superstitions blended with sleep, too. A man who died in his sleep might be seen as unlucky or even cursed. Whispers of ghost phantoms of drowned sailors circulated in tight quarters. Some ships were believed to be haunted, their halls echoing with snores that didn't belong to the living. Sleep, already uneasy, took on a mythical quality among crews, who believed they shared their hammocks with more than just the living dot. So how did sailors survive years of such fragmented rest? What did it do to their minds, their health, their sense of time, and how did these rhythms shape the culture of life at sea? As voyages stretched on from weeks to months and sometimes years, the effects of broken, poor quality sleep quietly compounded. Sailors in the age of sail lived in a world where exhaustion was simply part of the job, a background hum to every task, every lookout, every climb up the rigging. The damage wasn't always visible, but it was constant. Sleep deprivation over time wore down the body and mind. Sailors developed chronic fatigue, and many suffered from what we might now call sleep debt, cumulative lack of rest that affected reaction times, mood, and even decision. Some ships saw men become irritable, paranoid, or listless after long voyages, though it was rarely connected to sleep at the time. The medical understanding of rest was minimal, and fatigue was considered a weakness of character more than a health risk. Illness, too, was tied to poor sleep. With weakened immune systems and damp, crowded conditions, sailors were vulnerable to fevers, respiratory diseases, and infections. These were often worsened by nights of shallow rest interrupted by bells' orders and the relentless sound of the sea. The simple need to lie still and recover was often out of reach. Yet within this difficult life, routines formed. Sailors developed sleeping rituals to adapt. Some tied personal items to their hammock ropes, marking their space in the dark and claiming a little piece of home. Others sang quietly to themselves, to lull their minds into rest, or read aloud from worn books during downtime. Faith and superstition mixed into bedtime as well, prayers, charms, and whispered hopes for calm seas and an uninterrupted nap. Occasionally, a ship would dock and offer a rare full night's sleep on solid ground. But even this came with challenges. Many sailors reported land sickness after long periods at sea, the feeling that the ground itself was swaying beneath their feet. After so long in a moving hammock, stationary beds felt unnatural, even disorienting. Some preferred returning to their slings on the ship, where the gentle sway, despite all else, was familiar. Interestingly, the hammock, a symbol of rest at sea, eventually made its way ashore. Naval institutions, including hospitals and training schools, continued to use hammocks for decades. Soldiers and explorers in other parts of the world adopted them for portability and comfort. In this way, a sailor's sleep habit, born of necessity, quietly influenced cultures beyond the oceans. And despite all the hardship the sailors endured, they navigated storms, fought battles, and crossed entire oceans on little more than interrupted dreams and muscle memory. Sleep, however fractured, was still found between the tides, and when a sailor finally did fall into a deep slumber, rocked by the sea, it was perhaps one of the most honest rests a human could take, earned through salt, toil, and the quiet rhythm of waves against wood. What does it mean, then, that some of the greatest maritime feats in history were accomplished not in peak condition, but in a fog of fatigue? And how might our modern obsession with perfect sleep seem to those who found dreams between cannon fire and creaking beams? In the medieval world, the night was not simply a time for sleep, was a time of danger, silence, and, for a few, duty. While most people sought the warmth of their beds, others were tasked with staying awake. These nocturnal guardians were the quiet sentinels of sleeping communities. Their lives structured not around daylight hours, but around the uncertain rhythms of the dark. The watchmen, often appointed by towns or villages, were among the most visible figures in medieval nighttime life. Their role was simple in theory, but crucial in practice: to keep a community safe while it slept. They patrolled the streets with lanterns, staffs, or horns, wearing heavy cloaks against the chill. Some towns used bells or clappers to signal their presence or warn of fires, thieves, or approaching danger. These men were often older, less physically able citizens who could no longer do hard labor during the day but were still strong enough to pace the streets at night. In smaller communities, the job rotated among residents as a civic duty rather than a full-time position. In cities, it could be a paid job, though rarely a well-paid one. Regardless of the arrangement, the watchmen were a fixture in the landscape of medieval night. But the watchman was not the only person awake inside the homes. Someone often stayed up late or rose during the night to tend to the fire, care for infants, or prepare for early morning work. More often than not, this was the wife or eldest daughter. While the men might be sleeping off their labor, women kept the house running, even in the dark hours. They would check the hearth essential for heat and cooking and, sometimes even, sleep nearby to ensure the coals didn't die. A dead fire could mean hours of difficulty the next morning, especially in winter. These women also tended to the sick, which was a common nighttime task. With no real hospitals and limited access to physicians, care fell to family members. Herbal remedies were prepared, compresses changed, and prayers whispered through the night. In wealthier households, servants or apprentices might be designated for night duty, especially in large estates or manors. In some cases, castle guards and stable hands would be on rotating shifts. But even in the grandest halls, sleeplessness had its caretakers. Interestingly, staying awake wasn't always a burden. Some people chose the night for solitude or reflection. Monks and nuns often divided their sleep to wake for night prayers, a practice called vigils or matins, depending on the hour. This was considered a sacred duty, a form of spiritual watchkeeping that mirrored the physical duties of the town watchman. So, while the image of medieval life often evokes people huddled in bed as the sun sets, the reality was more complicated. Many were awake, some by choice, others by obligation. The night was not empty, it was watched, guarded, and quietly tended. But how did these nightly rhythms affect the health and lives of those who lived by the dark? And what happened when those entrusted to stay awake failed in their duty? In the medieval world, a single night's failure to stay alert could lead to ruin. Fire was one of the most feared nighttime threats, so feared, in fact, that some cities passed laws requiring citizens to cover their fires before bed. This was the origin of the word curfew, from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire. Unattended hearths could throw sparks that set thatch roofs alight, especially in close-packed wooden towns. A single blaze could wipe out a street or an entire town before dawn. That's why watchmen carried not just horns, but wooden rattles, designed to wake sleeping neighbors if smoke or flame was spotted. Some towns even employed fire watchers specifically trained to detect signs of danger by scent or flicker. But even with vigilance, disasters still happened, often sparked by a single glowing ember or an unattended candle. Nighttime also drew out the opportunists. Thieves knew when the town was asleep, and they exploited that stillness. Housebreaking wasn't easy, locks were primitive, and doors often barred from within, but livestock theft was common. A man could steal a pig or a chicken under cover of darkness and be gone long before morning. It was partly for this reason that dogs were commonly kept, especially in rural areas, not just as companions or herders, but as nighttime alarms. And while the watchman was intended to be a deterrent, his effectiveness varied widely. Some were deeply committed to their role, pacing with care, pausing to listen for strange noises. Others, particularly if underpaid or conscripted, were prone to napping themselves or accepting bribes to look the other way. There are records from English towns in the 1300s complaining about drunken watchmen who slept against the alehouse walls. Meanwhile, inside the homes, the wives and caretakers often had their own reasons to remain alert. In villages prone to wolf attacks or bandit raids, windows and doors were reinforced at night. Family members took turns listening for strange sounds, howling, footsteps, the creak of gate hinges. In times of local unrest, women might sleep in shifts, especially when their husbands were away on seasonal work or war. Interestingly, superstition also played a role in the night's unease. In many parts of Europe, the witching hour, roughly between midnight and 3 a.m., was feared. Some believed that demons, ghosts, or witches roamed freely then, searching for homes with unguarded souls. This belief may have indirectly encouraged families to assign someone to stay conscious, even if they didn't admit it was fear that kept them up. In urban monasteries and some towns, night bells rang to keep time, marked prayers, or signal shifts for guards. This clockwork rhythm gave the illusion of structure, but it didn't always guarantee safety. The dark, for all its silence, was a living presence filled with dangers, both real and imagined. As night stretched on and the weight of sleeplessness settled in, one had to ask, how did those few entrusted to guard the sleeping majority carry that burden night after night? And what happened when they succumbed to exhaustion? As dawn broke over medieval towns and villages, the unseen labor of the night faded into the background. The watchmen retreated from the empty streets, their footsteps forgotten as the cobbled paths filled again with carts, tradesmen, and livestock. Inside homes, wives laid down for a short rest after stoking morning fires, their nighttime work quietly replaced by the hum of daily chores. Though the world rose anew, the weariness clung to those who had kept the night. Sleep deprivation among medieval night watchers and caregivers was very real, even if not studied or diagnosed as it might be today. These individuals were the city. Watchmen or household caretakers rarely had the luxury of structured rest. Many worked during the day as well, especially in poorer households, where survival required every adult to contribute. The idea of 8 hours of sleep was, of course, foreign to them. Sleep was fragmented, caught between responsibilities. Some historians believe that medieval people often practiced segmented sleep, a natural pattern where people would sleep in 2 phases, waking in the middle of the night for a few hours, before returning to bed. During this interval, many would pray, tend to tasks, or, for those on duty, patrol their environments. For watchmen and wives alike, this was not theory, it was daily life. The burden of nighttime vigilance was also unequally shared. Women, in particular, bore the weight of domestic wakefulness. In addition to fire tending and infant care, women managed illness, brewed medicinal teas, and prepared next-day meals, sometimes starting before the first roosters crow. Their nights, like their days, were often consumed by care for others. Their stories rarely appear in chronicles or records, but their quiet work shaped the very foundation of household survival. The watchmen, meanwhile, became symbolic figures, sometimes mocked for their sleepiness, other times praised for their bravery in larger cities. Their role eventually evolved into more organized night patrols or early forms of policing. But in the medieval era, they were simply part of the background, expected to do a difficult, thankless job, while others slept soundly. Despite the hardships, the presence of someone awake at night gave medieval communities a sense of security. It created a rhythm, however imperfect, between sleep and vigilance, between vulnerability and defense. The fire was less likely to go out, the door less likely to be left unlatched, the shadow less likely to become danger, all because someone remained awake. In modern times, we rarely think about who stays awake while we sleep. Yet the legacy of these medieval night watchers lives on in firefighters, night shift nurses, security guards, and parents watching over a sick child. The burden of night has never disappeared. It has only shifted hands, so the next time you lie in bed at night, drifting off under the hum of electricity and the silence of locked doors, you might pause to wonder who is still awake, quietly, guarding the dark. And how many centuries has that role passed from one weary soul to the next? And now, dear listener, our quiet wander through the shadows of history comes to an end. Weird sleep habits of medieval people, and more strange, tender glimpses into the ways people once rested, dreamed, and waited for morning. Thank you for being here, for letting this story unfold softly in your night. Whether your eyes are already heavy, or you're just beginning to drift, know that you're part of a long line of dreamers who've watched the stars, listened to silence, and found comfort in the hush of nighttime. Wherever you are now, may your night be just as still as theirs once was. A warm bed, a gentle breath, the hush of something ancient settling in. If you felt held by this moment, you're welcome to subscribe, but only if it feels right, like turning a page when you're ready, or tucking in just a little deeper. And now, as the candle dims and the night folds in like soft blankets, rest easy, sleep well. We'll return again in the quiet heart of history. Good night.